You can have the best AI out there. And if you can't figure out how to connect it into your radiology practice's workflow, it doesn't matter how good it is, right? And that's the fundamental informatics piece of it that I think is still so important and that we can't ignore while we're talking about all the new exciting stuff.
Welcome to Frame by Frame, Rethink Imaging, a podcast by Apologetic. Here, we explore the intricate world of medical imaging, aiming to dissect the field and inspire both professionals and curious minds alike. I'm your host, Chris St. John. My guest today is Dr. Tessa Cook, a cardiovascular radiologist and national leader in imaging informatics and practice transformation. She serves as Vice Chair of Practice Transformation and Director of the Imaging Informatics Fellowship at Penn Medicine, where she also leads the 3D and Advanced Imaging Lab. Dr. Cook helped design programs like the High-Risk Follow-Through Initiative to close gaps and improve radiology workflows. She's a passionate educator, former chair of the Society for Imaging Informatics and Medicine, and a driving force behind making radiology more efficient, more human-centered, and future-ready. What I really enjoyed about Tessa is just like she is such a clear-cut case of a problem solver, and it comes through in every answer that she gives. She doesn't start with the technology, she always starts with the problem and is constantly figuring out the simplest path to fixing it. We get into how that thinking led her team to build a follow-up tracking system that caught early cancers in its first year, how she evaluates whether an AI tool is actually going to help or add more noise, and why she thinks the hardest part of this work is never just the tech. We also get into what she's learned from training over 100 informatics fellows, how Penn's AI governance evolved, and how to approach concepts of ground truth when dealing with AI. Enjoy the episode. Tessa, it is so good to have you here today.
So great to be here, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so I have sent you a bunch of questions before the fact. And of course, my first question for you is not going to have come from that sheet because I was doing a little additional interview prep and research. And I found just like a super short interview piece on the SIM website where you said that if you could choose anyone as a mentor, you would choose Chef Gordon Ramsay. And as a former chef, as somebody who has indulged in a bit of reality television, I felt like I would be remiss if I didn't start out by asking you to expand on that answer a little bit, because I feel like it would help me get to understand how you're thinking a little bit better.
I feel like you dug into some sort of time machine. My goodness. All right. So you brought this up. We're jumping in. So back in the day, before I had kids, which was now, the better part of 11 years ago, my husband and I used to love to watch all of Gordon Ramsay's various shows, right? The ones where he would tear into people and help them sort their stuff out, but also just
the idiot sandwich thing with the bread.
Idiot sandwich, this is a hockey puck. I mean, those quotes still find their way into our kitchen from time to time.
Iconic.
Yeah, but if you actually sort of peeled back the bluster part of it, which is the made for TV. And also, I will say that if you watched the American shows versus the shows in the UK, there was a distinct personality difference, which was also fascinating. But there were a lot of leadership lessons in there. And it was a lot about working with people, leading a team, having integrity in the process. And I think, it's actually really good television. And, the drama part, if you like that too, great. But I think that's really where that was coming from was, the man knows a thing or two about leading teams successfully and working hard. And it was cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was literally just talking about, because of my restaurant background, I was literally just talking about this with Dr. Sodikson the other day, when he was talking about the importance of like radiologists understanding, bits and pieces of medical physics and wanting to work with the techs to learn how to run the machines and like gaining a more comprehensive understanding of the members of his team, what they're up to, how they work in order to optimize. And I think that that's kind of the same message here, especially with Chef Ramsay and like the brigade kitchen approach.
Yeah, very similar sort of high pressure environments, lives perhaps not as at stake quite so much in a kitchen.
No, just feelings.
I mean, not that you want to get any of your customers sick either, but say lots of parallels, I think, being able to successfully run a team, get people to work together, and also with some pride, for lack of a better word, in the eventual deliverable. We take patient care very seriously, and he clearly takes, good food very seriously. And so there were many analogies to draw there. It was cool.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for indulging me for that little tangent. And so now to focus more on you yourself, you have this unique background with, all this engineering experience and then medicine. You have the MD and PhD in bioengineering. I'm curious how your kind of interdisciplinary start shaped the way that you think about radiology and workflow problems.
So, medicine was always the eventual goal, if you will. Engineering was not really on the horizon till I got to junior year of high school. And
Oh, that's way earlier than I thought you were going to say.
Well, it was a decision that impacted the subsequent year. So, I cut it a little close there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was interesting. So I had a good friend when I was a junior who she was a senior and applying to colleges and things like that, and told me about biomedical engineering, which I hadn't really heard of before that. And I had always had an interest in computer science from an early age, but always also knew that medicine was the ultimate goal. And the more I learned about BME, the more I realized this is kind of perfect for me, And so I ended up with a double major in biomedical engineering and computer science from Johns Hopkins. But really, it just kind of, well, as many things in my career trajectory have, I didn't plan for them. I just sort of followed opportunity where it took me, and that's how I got there, And so I loved engineering. I think it still impacts what I do every day. Radiology is the perfect clinical companion for the engineering interest, and informatics certainly, because I problem solve all day. Whether it's in the clinic, whether it's with my innovation team, whether it's with the 3D lab. I mean, that is the part of my job that I truly enjoy, is solving problems and fixing things.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I know you have multiple titles, but one of them, if I'm correct, is Vice Chair of Practice Transformation. That's still a title? Yes. Okay.
Still a title.
Beautiful. Just making sure. And so, I'm not super deep into the academic radiology space. I host this show. I learn what I learned from our guests and out in the world. I'm curious what practice transformation means at just like a high level to you and in your day to day.
Yeah, I think you can define it different ways, and I know people define it in different ways. I think of practice transformation as using technology, using innovation, using team building to change and improve the way that we deliver care. And, it doesn't always have to do with technology. It really has to do with sort of shining a light on a problem and trying to figure out if there's a way to optimize a process to improve experience, whether it's the patient experience, whether it's the healthcare workers' experience, regardless of whose experience it is. And, sometimes it just takes a small change, but it takes someone looking and identifying there's need for that change to sort of start the process, if you will.
Right. And I feel like that's absolutely like a running theme throughout your professional career, because you built what was called Radiance, dose tracking software, and just gave it away for free during your residency in 2010. Is that roughly right?
That was my first real kind of serious.
I know we're going way back.
Yeah, we are going way back. A real serious foray into informatics started with dose monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
I had a number of phenomenal mentors in the informatics space in residency, but Bill Boone and Woojin Kim in particular. And
I know Woojin.
Yeah, everybody knows Woojin.
Yeah.
And Woojin is internationally renowned. And I would have been 2009, 2010 would have been my second and third years of radiology residency. And it was around the time that there were these very well publicized instances of patients being overexposed to radiation from CT with visible side effects, right? Hair loss, skin redness, things like that. And it really, it talk about shining a light on a problem, right? It shone a light on a problem. And the hard part was, okay, well, how do you get to this data? And so we got creative with how we could get to the data. The specialty as a whole moved forward from a standards perspective. There was a DICOM standard to do this for years. It just hadn't been adopted. And so it was kind of the perfect storm of people paying attention to this data, starting to optimize protocols, looking at benchmarking and creating, diagnostic reference levels. I mean, you look at how far things have come in the last 15 plus years. It's really cool to see. But that was my first real big informatics project, was Radiance and dose monitoring.
Yeah. When you went to Penn and took on this title, Vice Chair of Practice Transformation, were there any specific problems that you were trying to shine a light on at that point? Like, did you have things top of mind, or did you kind of go in carte blanche to kind of see what you found?
So I've only had the role I've only had the title since 2022. I've had the role in a fashion for some years even prior to that. And what we do is, so I basically run the innovation hub in our department, and was very fortunate to learn from our chief innovation officer at the time, Roy Rosen, how to do this stuff. Not that I will pretend that I can do it nearly as well as Roy can, but I learned, talk about the other set of quotes that runs in my head is these little nuggets of wisdom that Roy taught us over the years.
Mhm.
But, making it easy for people to do the right thing, reducing cognitive burden. And we really started out very focused within the department, looking at problems around closing the follow-up loop, figuring out how to better identify patients who had a follow-up recommendation on an imaging study, and trying to make sure that they got whatever that follow-up was, whether it was, a downstream imaging, another downstream imaging study, a biopsy, et cetera. And so we've worked on variations of that theme a lot over the years. The other thing that we've done a lot with is resident education. So the team has supported a variety of tools, developed and continues to support a variety of tools that help our radiology residents throughout their training, to get feedback about their cases on call, to help them make sure that they're hitting all of their milestones over the 4 years of residency. And now looking at incorporating LLMs to do a lot of this also, and really trying to build tools that make it easy for radiologists, not just trainees, to get at data that it would be very hard for them to get at manually. Keeping track of interesting cases, getting feedback on the yield of your biopsies. These are not things for which systems exist, and it would be unrealistic to expect a radiologist for every interesting case to make a note for themselves and then keep checking back every couple of months to see what happened to that patient. So these are sorts of things that we've built over the years. Many of them focused in the department, but then also things that have grown out of the department, which has been really exciting.
Yeah, for sure. And so I want to follow up, pun intended, about your patient. Do you mind explaining the Pennsylvania Act 112 and your research kind of surrounding it?
Yeah, so we have legislation in the state of Pennsylvania. It's called the Patient Test Results Information Act. And I think it was signed into law in 2018 or 19. I
18.
can't quite remember. 18.
18.
And what it required was that for any finding which and I think I'm quoting from the legislation now, a reasonably prudent person would seek medical attention within 3 months. I read this chunk of that bill a few times. That the imaging facility should notify the patient. And I think the notification could be different things. A lot of practices opted for, a letter in the mail. Some sent electronic notifications. But either way, if there was something that the patient needed to follow up on within 3 months, the imaging facility was required through this law to let them know. And we looked at it in a few, and so the way that most of us approached this was to, flag those reports in some way and then generate a list of patients to whom the notification had to be sent. And so we went back after a few months and we looked at least to the best of our knowledge, whether it was making a difference. Could we tell from the medical record whether anything was actually happening sooner because this letter was getting sent out? And perhaps not surprising to some of us, the answer was no. In the majority of cases, the office had already notified the patient before the letter arrived. So I guess it was a nice backup, but perhaps it was serving as a reminder, but it was not the initial communication. But it did require practices in Pennsylvania to do a lot of additional work, and we're all still doing this additional work. I know that the legislation has gone back through the state legislature a couple of times for some potential revisions, but I don't know that the requirement to send this notification has changed since 2018.
Right. Right. It's that language, a reasonably prudent person. I hear that, and my gut response to that is, I don't know. I don't think I know many reasonably prudent people. I think human beings, and particularly, I'm not trying to get on a soapbox here, but particularly folks in the U.S. healthcare system, where things are expensive, access is not necessarily easy for a lot of people. When you say reasonably prudent, I'm I think back to when I was working in restaurants and the folks that I worked with, we were all on paper reasonably prudent people, but I do not think the large percentage of us would have been showing up for those follow-ups.
Yeah, and there's lots of reasons that people don't go to their follow-up, right? They forget, they have to reschedule, maybe they never get around to scheduling. Life happens, right? And so so that's why we have spent so much time trying to build systems to help people, to remind people, to make sure that, particularly when it's, sometimes it's a finding that could be an early cancer. And if you go get that follow-up and you get diagnosed early, that makes a big difference for your health going forward. And so, we don't want anybody to end up with a late diagnosis because they missed a follow-up. But exactly to your point, right? Life happens. There are lots of reasons why these downstream exams don't get done. Sometimes they get done in other systems and we don't have access to that information, right? There's no one choice for where you go for your care necessarily. And that's fine. The only downside to that, the main downside to that, is that there's not enough good information exchange between facilities for those of us taking care of patients, to know what is truly still incomplete or outstanding and where to effectively nudge.
Yeah. And so, it's you've done a lot of work trying to bridge this gap. You built an automated radiology recommendation tracking engine. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Oh my God, is that really what the acronym is?
That is really what the acronym stands for. We worked, sometimes you work harder on the, not really, but it feels sometimes
absolutely.
Like you work harder on the acronym than you do on the actual solution.
Uh-huh.
But we put a lot of thought into that one. Yeah. So the idea behind Arnie was that, in really this hugely, because we built this before large language models existed, right? This was heavily dependent on the hard work of my colleagues in the department to actually flag these cases with a very discrete set of data elements that included which organ needed the follow-up, what the follow-up should be, and when it should be obtained. And so what we were able to do is then mine all this data and start to look for whether or not people had appointments scheduled, whether they needed a nudge, or whether their clinician needed a nudge. And so we tried a variety of nudges. We tried a lot of things. Some things worked, some things didn't. But eventually this basically, in a few different permutations, gave rise to something that we have now across Penn Medicine called the high-risk follow-through program. And the goal of high-risk follow-through is, across the enterprise, and we are building out use cases incrementally. So we haven't, sort of covered everything across the entire health system yet, but we're working on a variety of things, not just within radiology anymore. We're looking at other kinds of testing. We're looking at laboratory testing. We're looking at patients who get diagnoses that could put them at high risk for chronic illness later, and really just trying to create a series of earlier interventions so that we can help people who need help sooner and save them from, bad outcomes down the road.
Yeah. With the high-risk follow-through program, how do you think about measuring success?
That's a great question. I'll give you one example. So we started with lung nodules on CT, and within the first year of the program, I think maybe not even the first year, we had identified a number of patients who had had overdue follow-ups, and 12 of them were diagnosed with cancer. And so those were 12 patients that are now being treated. We caught cancers early, and we were able to get them plugged in with the resources they needed to start their treatment earlier. And a few of them even said, I didn't even know that I needed to get this test done. And so that's real, those are our lives saved, hopefully, through this intervention.
That's fantastic to hear. Let's expand out a bit beyond follow-up. I'm curious, what other issues are you, shining your flashlight around at these days? Like workflow inefficiencies, things with interpretation or reporting or scheduling.
There's a lot of AI happening right now.
Oh yeah.
You might be surprised to hear.
Yeah, and you're doing a lot. You're doing agentic AI work with BlueGen as well. Am I correct? Is that correct?
We're doing some agentic stuff. We're looking at sort of the whole spectrum, everything from what you would consider narrow or a really specialized AI that has a very particular task, to all of what you can do with generative AI and reporting, to foundation model draft reporting solutions now, because the field is really moving fast. And if there's one thing that we don't do in healthcare, it's move fast. And so we're all learning and trying to figure it out. And so I co-chair our AI steering committee. So we oversee all of the AI that ultimately ends up in the clinical space, and, make sure that there's governance around it, that there is rigorous evaluation before we put something into the clinic, because the whole point of, maybe not the whole point, but AI is heavily touted these days as a solution to the workforce workload mismatch, to all of the inefficiencies in our workflow. But you run the risk of creating more inefficiency if you don't do this right. And so we have really been trying and are very deliberate in how we deploy solutions and what solutions we deploy, because we really do want to increase efficiency. And, it's not just about efficiency, because, everybody says, well, what's the ROI of AI? Well, how would you like to measure the ROI of AI? Because it's not necessarily always in dollars. If you can increase workflow efficiency, that's great. That ultimately helps patients. If you can decrease the cognitive burden on clinicians, that's great. That helps the clinicians. It also helps the patients. If you can improve patient safety, if you can improve patient outcomes, these are all good things, right? To me, this is all ROI. And I realize that I perhaps have the easy job because I'm not the one that makes the budget, and that, the budget has to make sense as well. But I really do think that the eventual ROI might have to be measured in dollars, but initially all of these other aspects are important as well. And you can eventually get to financial benefit from everything.
Yeah, for sure. I want to harp on just a little comment you made at the beginning of that answer, where you were talking about AI governance. And pretty recently, I feel like y'all have wrapped up Penn's AI governance model. And can you tell me a little bit about what that process looked like? I mean, I think you were at it for 7 years.
So I don't know that I was involved in all of that. So, but we've had our governance group in radiology since 2018-19. So we're definitely at the 7-year mark. I wouldn't say wrapped up. We're still going. But
right, yeah, I mean, fair.
Well,
yeah, the AI isn't stopping, so I guess the governance ain't stopping either.
There's the radiology level governance piece, but there also is enterprise level governance, and so we feed into their structure as well. We're sort of the clinical imaging kind of first step, and then it continues there through the rest of the organization, because we can't unilaterally put anything into our environment if the enterprise has embedded it appropriately as well. So it's ongoing. It continues to evolve. We and I will be the first to admit, we made it a little bit onerous at the beginning, and we have made it far less onerous for everybody, ourselves included, to, review these tools, to have a liaison with a potential industry partner, to do the evaluations, prepare the data to do the evaluations, all of these things. And it's work. I'm not going to tell you it's not work. It's work, because it is also part of the American College of Radiology's ArchAI designation. So it's the ACR's Recognized Center for Healthcare AI. And I should probably disclose that I'm now the commission chair for informatics for the ACR. So, so governance is a big component of ArchAI as well, because you need to have a process around figuring out what AI you need. Does it work on your data, in your practices, keeping an eye on it, knowing what's in the environment, what's not in the environment, knowing how it's working, so actually doing monitoring. So all of these components are important, and it's, especially as the tools evolve, you face new challenges in kind of keeping up with all of these components also.
Yeah. I feel like I need to get you a hat rack for all of your different roles.
I just need a hat rack for all of my different hats, because I got through most of my life not owning a single hat, and now there's a little collection growing.
You have an abundance of hats on at all times. And so
yes,
when you're evaluating AI tools, do you mind just giving me like a high level understanding of like what your criteria is and what your just approach to thinking about it is?
So we have a three-phase approach, and the way that it works is the first phase is really, does the model work? It's really what it comes down to, is model performance. So let's say if we're talking about pixel-based AI, we take some representative cases, we de-identify them, we get the solution, we run them through, and then we look at the results. And, we've got ground truth that's been established, by a radiologist in some fashion, whether we're taking, in some use cases, you can take the original report and extract it from there. In other instances, you actually have radiologists, creating new ground truth for you based on the images. And phase one is really, it's retrospective, and it's, does the model work? Because if the model doesn't work, we're not going to put it into the clinic just to see it not work more. Again, it comes back to efficiency and, having not enough radiologists to take care of all the patients that need care. And so we want to make sure that we don't introduce inefficiency or a tool that is just not going to help. So if the retrospective phase is good, we move into a limited prospective. So we give a small handful of users access to the solution. They use it prospectively in the course of routine patient care. And then we're still evaluating model performance, but we're also at that point evaluating user experience. And if that phase goes well, we expand it to a few more users just to make sure there's nothing that we're not accounting for. We are geographically a large health system. We are, in terms of specialty, we have a lot of depth and breadth. And so depending on the particular AI solution, we want to make sure that it really adds value for everybody. And if we get to that point, then, and everybody feels like it's important to move forward and with a purchase, then we do. But the stakeholders all have, input at any point in this process. And so, and we take their feedback very seriously.
Yeah. What is your sort of approach and thought about reaching ground truth? Because I feel like it's like kind of nebulous.
Yeah, it feels like that sometimes, right? And I think it really depends on what you're talking about, right? If it's a measurement, you can say, well, the AI said it was 4.5 centimeters, but then the radiologist reported it as 5.5 centimeters. And if, that is a discordance, now it's entirely possible that either of those were wrong, right? Did the radiologist mistype? Did they measure incorrectly? Was the AI measurement wrong? I mean, this is why we talk about concordance and discordance, right? And not ground truth or reference standard, because unless you've got a perfect ground truth, it's hard to make that comparison. One of the things that we aren't doing very much in the AI space right now is that a lot of the primary processing of the data is really of the pixel data, right? So stroke AI, intracranial hemorrhage, pneumothorax, imaging study goes in, AI result comes out.
Yeah, like the classic examples for radiology AI, I feel like, right?
Yeah. But you could say, for anything else, right? So, whether you're trying to detect a disease process in, whether it's cardiac MRI, whether it's a pneumonia detector, whatever it might be, in the right depending on the clinical context, the answer could be different. But if the AI is only looking at the imaging and not having any appreciation for the clinical context, that could also be a reason why the AI output is discordant from the radiologist's interpretation. And another, ground truth, as you called it, could actually be patient outcome, biopsy, for example, right? So if you're talking about breast cancer, imaging-based risk assessment for breast cancer, and you're making predictions into the future, you might have a data point in the future that tells you whether the AI prediction was accurate or not. But you might have to wait some period of time, right? So it gets it does get complicated. And so I think we are really trying to come up with surrogate measures, for lack of a perfect ground truth. But one of the big challenges now is that we don't get this clinical context piece readily incorporated to be able to have, AI is not really approaching the imaging the same way that I, as a radiologist, approach the imaging, because I have a whole additional set of data points that the AI model does not. And I know how to interpret those data points.
Do you mind telling me what they are?
Well, it depends, right? So for example, I'm a cardiovascular radiologist, right? So if I pick up a cardiac MRI to interpret, I want to know what the clinical question is. I want to know, has the patient had an echo? Have they had a cath? What sort of symptoms have they had? Is there a family history? Do they have a cardiac device? All of these things are information to me, right? Not all of them are necessarily encapsulated in the imaging directly. If we see something on a chest x-ray, for example, in isolation, that might look like an acute pneumonia. But if you have a prior study from 6 months earlier and that same opacity was there, that could actually be scar in the lung. And so it's all of this additional information, right? If you're, does the patient have a fever? Do they have, are they immunocompromised? Is there some reason they should have pneumonia? Did they have a family member or a close contact that was sick last week, right? This is all useful data that AI does not yet consider.
So you direct the Imaging Informatics Fellowship at Penn, and I'm kind of curious just how you approach training the next generation on informatics and emerging technology.
Yeah, so when I was a resident at Penn, I mentioned, there were a number of faculty, in addition to Bill and Woo-Jin, Kurt Langwatz was there, Steve Forey was there, and it was this, it was like 4 luminaries in the field, all of whom were my clinical attendings, but also were my, informatics mentors. And I used to go to meetings and people would say, "Oh, it's so great you have the fellowship there and you're training all these people." And I would have to say, "What fellowship? I'm still a resident and we don't have a fellowship." So I heard this enough times that by the time I joined the faculty, I said to my future, well, I guess my also current department chair, I think we should start a fellowship. The rest of the world already thinks we have one. Let's do this. So we actually went to visit Paul Naji at Hopkins and saw how he ran his program, which was a very different, structured somewhat differently than what we ended up doing. But he was very gracious to host us. And, really what I wanted to do was sort of create a version of what I had been able to experience as a resident, right? To be able to have access to amazing leaders in the field, to make those connections, because that's what my mentors did for me, right? They helped me to make these connections in person, because those were the days where everything was in person, right? Where at an RSNA or a SIM or an ACR or anything else, to actually help me create my network in informatics. And so that was one of the things I wanted to achieve with this program. but really to give people, an in-depth exposure to all of what really matters in clinical imaging informatics right now. The fundamentals, the standards, the importance of interoperability, how you achieve that. And then, while we were sort of, going about our weekly meetings, all of a sudden now there's AI. And, despite the fact that it is the Imaging Informatics Fellowship, I will admit we talk a lot about AI, right? Informatics is a lot more than just AI, and all that fundamental stuff that, connects the pipes and keeps the data flowing is absolutely critical. But we talk a lot about AI too, and how to implement it, how to do the governance, how to evaluate things, how to think critically about tools. And so we will have more than 100 alumni in about a month, a little over a month, which is really exciting. The program started in 2013 with 8 fellows, and across those alumni, we have vice chairs of informatics, we have CMIOs, we have associate CMIOs. I mean, people have really been incredibly successful, and it's heartening to see. And we have these mini reunions sometimes at meetings where there's a little critical mass of us, but it's hard to get 100 plus people together at any point.
Absolutely. I can't even get 5 together for Dungeons and Dragons.
There you go. But it's been a great program, and we do a mixture of things. So I basically call all my friends in the informatics world and I say, hey, will you hang out with my fellows for an hour, and they are incredibly gracious with their time. And so I really do appreciate the fact that faculty from other departments are helping my residents and my informatics fellows learn. So it is very generous of everybody to do that. It really is sort of a testament to the informatics community. We want more people. We want people who are excited about this field to be able to get involved and get plugged in. And so that's part of it. They all do a project. We do journal clubs. So every time we meet, someone presents a paper, and, it forces everybody to sort of think about what you read in the literature and how to really critically analyze what's out there. And we work through the second edition of the Practical Imaging Informatics textbook that was published through SIM. And we learn. It's hands-on learning. And sometimes things work and sometimes things don't work, but you learn.
Yeah. Forgive me for pulling at this thread, and we don't have to get too into it. But when you were talking about bringing up AI usage, like within the Informatics Fellowship, there was like a part of your tone that almost seemed apologetic. And I'm just like, to me, I feel like AI and the utilization of it as a tool feels like it's almost impossible at this point to do informatics work without I mean, of course you can do it without using AI as a tool, but it feels like kind of woven in at this point. And I'm curious if I was right about that tone and what was behind that.
Hey, you were right about the tone, but not the intent behind it, actually. So,
okay, cool. Great.
So I'm glad you asked the question. So yeah, I mean, we all, we regularly sort of trade notes about, oh yeah, I tried doing this in Claude Code or Codex, or, Gemini's my favorite, or we're constantly doing all that stuff. So I have no problem with them, using AI and learning how to use AI responsibly. And that's really that's an important, very important piece of that, not just for my fellows, for my profession, quite honestly. The apologetic piece of it is that I am continuously aware of the fact that you can have the best AI out there, and if you can't figure out how to connect it into your radiology practice's workflow, it doesn't matter how good it is, right? And that's the fundamental informatics piece of it that I think is still so important, and that we can't ignore while we're talking about all the new exciting stuff. And so that's where the apologetic tone came from is, we do spend a lot of time talking about AI. And sometimes I feel like maybe more than we should, but I try very hard not to make it at the expense of them learning about all the other fundamental, important, critical things, DICOM, HL7, FIRE, IHE, right? And the very important role that IHE has in using all of those standards to help us build tools that actually make a difference.
Yeah. Okay. So to change Tessa hats one last time in this interview while I have you here, you just wrapped up serving on the SIM board as chair. And I'm curious, just like if chairing, it influenced your approach to what you're working on, specifically within innovation at Penn.
I had a really great time serving on the sim board. I was very fortunate. I got to sit at that table for years before I was actually a board member as a committee chair, various committees. And again, because my mentors got me a seat at the table, right? And it's just the value of mentorship and sponsorship and, creating that network and so by the time I became sim chair, I felt like I knew a lot about sim. So my term ended in 2024. And so I served a year as the past chair. Nabil Sufder is, it's hard to believe, time really flies. Nabil's finishing up his term as sim chair. Alex Tobin will take over in July. And so there's this great lineage of chairs that preceded me and chairs that succeeded me, all of whom I learned from. And I should also give a shout out to the sim CEO, to Cheryl Kreider-Carey, who is a self-proclaimed governance geek. And I would say, I think the biggest thing I learned from my time on the sim board was, the value of governance. And I learned a lot from Cheryl and have taken a lot of that back, both to Penn and to my role at the ACR. So, these volunteer roles are so valuable to us as well. Certainly we help our professional societies achieve a variety of things, but I've learned so much from volunteering with a number of different organizations, and it's been a really valuable experience for me.
Awesome. Well, with that, I feel like that is all the time we have today. It has been so much fun having you here. And I promise you, I will give you a little bit more time before I start hassling you down the road again.
It was a great conversation, Chris. I had fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This has been Dr. Tessa Cook, cardiovascular radiologist and national leader in imaging informatics and practice transformation. Dr. Cook, once again, thanks for being here.
Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging is brought to you by Imalogics. Here, you'll find engaging interviews with thought leaders, experts, and patients, sharing stories that showcase the transformative power of medical imaging. To discover how Imalogics is rethinking imaging in healthcare, visit imalogics.com. Be sure to subscribe to Frame by Frame Rethink Imaging on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And from all of us here at Imalogics, thanks for tuning in.